Hi, I'm Dr. Adam Weiss, and I am going to talk to you about best practices for teaching English language learners. Another way to phrase this would be English language learner scaffolds or instructional supports. This will be beneficial for any pre-service teachers seeking either their ESL or their bilingual teacher certification because these techniques are beneficial for learning language and for teaching language. Also, this could be great for existing teachers who are just trying to build on their present knowledge of how to best serve their English language learner students. All right. So first, it's important to develop content and language objectives. So you probably are already familiar with content objectives. In Texas, we call them the TEACs, but basically the content objective is the learning goal, the specific information and skills that the teacher is trying to transmit to students. And that's relative to the specific content area they're teaching: math, science, social studies, etc. Language objectives, however, are universal and go across content areas. Language objectives are what specific skills you are trying to teach your students. Also, what types of domains of language, listening, speaking, reading, and writing, will students be using during the lesson? Ideally, students are using all four language domains throughout the lesson. That way, they're fully developing their English skills. Another aspect of language objectives could also be what academic vocabulary you're going to teach your students and what academic vocabulary they will use throughout the lesson. And it's important that, regardless of what content subject you teach, you should develop language objectives because language is used in every content area. If you're a math or science teacher, students are going to need to be able to read the directions, read specific problems, read instructions on how to complete the activity or lab experiments, and also how to write and explain their thinking. For those who are history teachers, social studies teachers, even fine arts teachers, students will need to be able to read about the topic area to learn more about what they're trying to develop in terms of their knowledge. But also, students will also have to write their point of view and to explain their perspective or to summarize what they learned. So, regardless of what content area you teach, you should also be teaching students language skills and have students explicitly practice with language skills. And this is especially beneficial for English language learners who are still developing their English phrasing, their academic vocabulary, and their knowledge of proper grammar. So teaching explicit skills will be beneficial. So some examples of a content objective might be, for example, in third grade, one could be students will learn how to multiply 2-digit by 1-digit numbers using visual aids as well as computational techniques. The language objective for that lesson might be students will practice with their listening skills and speaking skills by discussing a problem with their partner. Or students will learn the new vocabulary term array or area model or product. And so it's okay to have more than one content objective and language objective, but you don't want to have too many because that could be overwhelming for students. Another thing that's important to note is that teachers need to post their content objectives and their language objectives for their students. And the teacher should go over them at the beginning of the lesson to give students a kind of like a trajectory or a guideline for what they're going to discuss during the lesson. Also, teachers need to review what they've taught their students and to go over key concepts at the end of the lesson. And one of those key things you need to review is what you have taught them in terms of your content objectives and your language objectives. A second scaffold that's very beneficial for English language learners is to connect content to students' prior learning. As much as possible, you should try to find out your students' previous learning experiences, their home life, what kind of activities they do at home, maybe what books they're reading, whether they explore nature, for example, or whether they do their own experiments at home with their parents involving science. Either way, you also know what your students have learned in previous grades because you can look back at other earlier grades' content objectives and their curriculum, and you can even ask previous teachers what they taught them, and you can connect your lesson to what students have already learned. As much as possible, try to find ways that you can explicitly link what you're teaching today to what students have learned before. That allows students to develop stronger new knowledge and to build on what they already know. So one way to do this at the beginning of a new lesson, after you've introduced the content objectives and the language objectives, is to ask students some guided questions about what they've already learned about a topic. So I gave the example of fractions in the first example. You might ask students before you teach a new topic on adding fractions, you might say, what do you already know about fractions? When have you used fractions in the past at home? Could you draw me a fraction or explain what this fraction means? And so connecting it to their previous knowledge and then building on that and teaching them how to add fractions is beneficial. And you could use this across all content areas. A third way to scaffold and support English language learners is to focus on the relevance of what you're teaching. So explicitly state how what you're teaching is important to their life or how it relates to their life. This is essential because that way students will be more likely to be engaged in what you're teaching. If they feel like they've had a personal experience with the learning, if they feel also that they will use this in the future and that they've seen other people use this information, they're more likely going to be interested in learning it. And one way to do this is to provide students with authentic learning activities. So giving them context or situations that are real world. So maybe having them do add money or math using supplies from the grocery store, or having them do an experiment using plants that they could grow in their home gardens, or having them read a job manual and write a work email to their employer where they persuade their employer to give them a raise or to improve benefits for the company. All of these things are authentic situations that students will experience most likely when they grow up. And so it's great to have not only exposure to that and practice with those concepts, but also students, once again, will see that relevance and will feel like that activity is more meaningful. So as much as possible, try to find authentic activities. Another way to do this is also to give students either inquiry-based learning or problem-based learning activities where you pose a problem or students research their own problem that they're interested in and they come up with their own solution and even try to implement their solution. Another scaffold, which most teachers already know, but it's always good to remind everyone, is to provide visuals. So there's different types of visuals you can provide. And the nice thing about visuals is that pictures can transcend languages. So even if a student is a beginner English speaker, or even if the student is a brand newcomer who's also still a beginner English speaker, but they've just come to the United States, they will benefit from visuals because that can explain things that maybe your words or your phrases might not transfer to students just yet. So it's great to have those visuals to provide that support. There's different types of visual supports. You could provide diagrams. You could provide visuals of vocabulary words. You could provide visuals of what's going on in a text so students can kind of understand a storyline or a nonfiction article. You could also provide visuals to give context, so to model a particular situation or to connect to students' prior knowledge, or even just overall images provide additional knowledge and comprehension of what's going on during the lesson. Similar to visuals, multimedia also are a valuable scaffold. So you have text that could be multimedia, like online text or digital text. You could have audio, video, animation. You could have graphics. Basically, multimedia is the combination of several different elements, and not just the visual presence, but also the audio. It appeals to the audio senses as well. And multimedia can be very beneficial. One nice thing to do is to do maybe like a digital jump start or an introduction of what you're about to teach by maybe showing students a short video of the topic, and you could show it either in their native language or also in English, or maybe both. You could show two different videos, one in their native language, one in English, depending on your classroom dynamics and how it works. But having that introductory video gives students kind of a roadmap of what you're about to cover, and it gives them a nice overview of the topic. Another way to scaffold learning is to provide students with guided notes. Guided notes are basically a note template where part of what you're trying to write out, the main points, are somewhat filled in for students, and then students are having to fill in the blanks of what's missing. So this helps students organize their notes. It also helps students identify and spend less time worrying about what's important and what's not important to write down, and rather just writing down the most important things that you, the teacher, have already identified as important. So students can focus on the key elements. They're also spending less physical time copying or writing, and that's very important for English language learners in particular, because if they're beginner or intermediate English language learners, they might still be struggling with writing complete sentences or spelling, and they're also going to be spending a lot of their cognitive energy just trying to understand what you're saying, to comprehend the lesson itself orally, to listen and understand what the teacher is saying. So having students have to not only listen and understand what the teacher says, but also make their own notes can be very overwhelming for many students. And so providing guided notes helps save that cognitive energy and also helps direct students' focus to the most important elements of the lesson. Also, students practice with how to use context clues to fill in the blanks. And so how to use context clues and to use their deductive reasoning skills to come up with a conclusion. And their conclusion is what they put in their blanks for their notes. Another way to scaffold instruction for English language learners, and as you'll notice, this is actually beneficial for all learners in general, is to sequence instruction in a step-by-step manner. So, first of all, it's important that when you're introducing a new topic, you want to start with the very easy fundamental concepts and then gradually increase the rigor or difficulty level. Also, if you're going over a process or an activity that has steps, it's great to actually write down those steps on the board or post it as an anchor chart in which students can refer to. Make sure that you're also using procedural sequencing, so you're continuously reviewing the process and the sequence in the order in which you're completing a task. Don't just skip through certain steps assuming students already know. Just assume students have need to be explained from the very beginning, from the very basic level. And then after students have seen the process over and over and you know they've seen all the steps, then you might choose to skip a few steps. But overall, I would recommend not skipping the steps. I would just go through it. That way students can always stay on track with you. And even if a student, let's say, is struggling to understand the preliminary earlier steps, if you go through the whole step and the whole process, then they can have a review of those earlier steps. Another thing to sequence instruction is to start out by providing the key details or a summary of what you're about to teach at the beginning of your lesson. And then close your lesson with another summary of what you've taught students. Another thing is whenever you are teaching a concept, make sure you give specific examples. That helps to sequence instruction. Another thing is sequence instruction by in terms of a release of responsibility. So by that, at the beginning of a new lesson, the teacher should be doing most of the modeling, the explicit instruction, the explanation. The teacher really needs to provide plenty of support for those students because it's something they haven't seen before. So the teacher should be actually physically doing the process that they're teaching, or doing practice problems, or explaining their thinking out loud, doing a think aloud. Eventually, though, the teacher starts to release some of that responsibility and give it back to the students. So first, you might have your explicit instruction where the teacher explains the key elements of the lesson. They go through the process, they model a few activities or skills, and they explain their thinking process out loud. Then teachers can have guided practice opportunities where students work with the teacher to practice the material, and they also have opportunities to work with their peers who can provide further support. Finally, after students have been able to be successful in demonstrating the skill with their teachers' support and their peer support, start to give students independent learning opportunities where they practice on their own while you walk around and give them feedback. This way, students gradually get more and more responsibility and learning autonomy to do things on their own, but it's not overwhelming. They have that scaffold of having their teacher and then later their peers provide support for them if needed. Another way to provide support or a scaffold for English language learners is to use physical hand gestures or to use pantomime or to be very cognizant of your facial expressions. And this is beneficial because this provides contextual support for students. So they might not understand everything you're saying, but if they see your gestures, they see you modeling it and physically doing an action, then they are more likely to comprehend what you're saying. Another great scaffold for English language learners is to provide them with sentence stems, or another term for this is sentence starters. So sentence stems or sentence starters provide a model of correct English phrasing. And it also helps students to see a model of correct punctuation and also syntax. So the word order in an English sentence and the parts of speech. And because it provides so much contextual support, it also relieves anxiety for students. So they don't feel like they have to do as much on their own. They have that kind of hint or that clue to get them started, and then that helps facilitate their expression. So a sentence stem basically starts with some language the teacher provides, and then it ends with like a blank or opportunities for students to complete the sentence on their own. So the problem of the story was ... and then the students would complete that. Or this was an interesting article because, and then, so it's modeling correct phrasing, and also it could be modeling academic writing in general. Another way to support ELL students is to provide students with discussion stems. Discussion stems are very similar to sentence stems. Another term could be discussion frames. They're actually primarily not so much for writing like sentence stems, but they're more for oral communication. So discussion frames give students kind of a clue of how to appropriately respond or to communicate their point of view. So, for example, a discussion frame for expressing maybe contrast with another person's point of view is, I'd like to add that blank. Or after listening to what you said, I also think this should be considered. So there's different sentence frames, and as you can see with the visuals I've provided, they help model academic vocabulary, and it's nice to teach them in particular context. So you might teach students how to orally communicate their ideas, how to express their uncertainty, how to express their confusion or their need for support, how to express how their opinion differs from another person's, or how to provide constructive feedback. So all of these, or how to summarize what they've learned. In the article, the main idea was, and then the student explains it. So there could be nice sentence frames for many different contexts, and they're beneficial to promote positive, accurate English phrasing during your oral communication opportunities where students are working with their partners or having a class discussion. And remember, developing students' oral language skills, their listening and speaking skills, also translates into developing their reading and writing skills. So it's, as much as possible, you want to include all four domains of language: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And so by incorporating discussion frames for listening and speaking, and incorporating sentence stems that we mentioned in the slide prior for reading and writing, those will be very beneficial for English language learners in developing their overall language ability. Another thing is to provide sequencing methods. So you might teach them how to form conclusions by providing different examples of sequencing. So explaining how to go from the concrete, from a specific example, to the abstract, the general principle. Or how to go the opposite way, where students use deductive thinking skills, where maybe you give them a general rule, like all polygons are closed figures that have straight edges. Well, then students have to conclude what could be some examples of polygons. Well, it could be a rectangle, a triangle, etc. And there's different types of sequencing, and you can look at the graph below, and I provided the source. But sequencing is beneficial because it's basically teaching students some thinking processes. Another way that you can support ELL students is by breaking the lesson into chunks. Another term is called chunking. So chunking is basically the way that learners can remember information more effectively. So if you were trying to memorize or remember some important concepts, you would probably not try to remember too many things at once. You would probably want to focus on one or two key points at a time, make practice with those, make sure you understand them, and then move on to others. So that's the whole point of chunking. Chunking is the idea of don't present the entire lesson all at once. Break it down into manageable pieces and teach each piece at a time, maybe for 1 to 2 minutes for each chunk. Then pause, ask students questions, and have students practice with that content, and to use that content in a different way. Maybe summarize what they've learned, turn and talk to their partner, act out what they learned, or model what they've learned. maybe answer practice problems, or demonstrate their knowledge in some way, create their own representation of their knowledge. After you see that students have mastered that one specific chunk, then you can move on to another piece of information. And we do chunking all the time. I mean, that's kind of how we developed phone numbers. So basically, the research showed that people can only really remember about 7 to 10 new things at a time, the average learner. So if you think about a phone number, it's not more than 9 digits. 10 digits. I got that wrong. It's not more than 10 digits. And also, it's chunked with an area code, which is like 3 digits. Then it's chunked by another 3 digits, and then 4 digits. So it's not too overwhelming. If necessary, a person could memorize the first 3 digits, the area code. Then they could focus on the other 3 digits, and then finally the final 4 digits. So that's an example of chunking. Or going over 1 or 2 vocabulary terms per day instead of teaching students a whole list of vocabulary terms is an example of chunking. Another way to provide support for students is to provide mixed ability grouping or heterogeneous grouping. Another term could be just called peer support or collaborative learning. Basically, the benefit of having multi-level language grouping and ability grouping is twofold. First of all, when you provide students with multi-level language ability grouping, students are going to learn academic vocabulary, proper phrasing, punctuation from their peers. So especially with English language learners, you want to pair them with someone who's at a higher level of English language proficiency. So if a student is a beginner English language learner, you want to make sure that their partner is ideally maybe an advanced or advanced high or even a native English speaker. This way, those people can model for that beginner English language learner correct English grammar, phrasing, and punctuation. So that's one benefit of having a multi-level language grouping. Another thing is when you have multi-level ability grouping, students also learn from each other. So the more advanced students, or the students that understand the content, can teach the students that are maybe struggling or need additional support, and they can teach their peers and explain it in a different way than their teacher, sometimes even more effectively than their teacher. And many times students actually listen to their peers more than their teacher. Another thing is that it provides great opportunities for the person who's teaching the other student to practice their oral language and communication skills of speaking and listening. Furthermore, that student becomes even more to have an even stronger grasp and understanding of the concept because they have to explain it in different ways to meet the needs of that individual partner that they're trying to help. I've always felt that I learn things better when I have to teach it to another person. Well, the same thing happens when you have those multi-level groups. The problem with having students of the same group, the same level, let's say you grouped all of your beginner ELL students all together. Well, the problem with that is they will not really have that much help from their peers. All of their peers will be at the same spot. They'll all be kind of struggling and still trying to develop the foundations of English language. So they won't really have a great model in their peers. However, if you mix them with students who are more advanced, they can learn from the more advanced students. And if you're concerned that maybe the student, let's say you don't speak your student's native language, so you want to partner the student with someone who speaks their native language, just make sure that that partner also happens to know a higher level of English than that current student. That way, that student can really translate for that student effectively, rather than just, if they both are at like the same level of English, then they might just resort to just talking in their native language and not really reteaching that lesson in English that you were trying to achieve by pairing those students together. So it's fine to pair ELL students together, especially if they share the same common language. The only thing is just make sure that in their group, there is at least one or two people that can model correct English phrasing, correct English reading comprehension, academic vocabulary, accurate punctuation, and elaborate discussion, elaborate expression, like providing lots of details. So we talked about this a little bit already, but collaborative learning is a scaffold in general, and it's beneficial for all students. So collaborative learning is beneficial because students really appreciate learning from their peers. They're more likely to be engaged. They're also more likely to be motivated to complete a task because they feel like they have to be to do a good job to support their group. They don't want to let their peers down. And so one way to do this and to effectively provide collaborative learning is to give specific explanation or specific instructions for students. Also, detail your expectation as a teacher. So what will be the specific product students produce? Will they be sharing out an answer? Will they be creating a poster? Will they be answering a question? Will they be writing an essay? What is the actual producible that students are going to demonstrate to you that they were on task and they completed the activity accurately? Then you also want to make sure that you provide students with a mutual goal. So students come together and they have a mutual goal, hopefully to complete the task. Then give each student a different role and switch up the roles. Don't just have the same student do the same role each time. And different roles could be the note taker, the presenter, the researcher, the materials manager, the organizer. There's different responsibilities you could give each student, but just make sure that each student's responsibility is clear. They know what they're expected to do, and also that each student's responsibility is essential. So the group could not be successful without each student doing their part. So that ensures accountability. Another way to provide scaffolds for ELL students is to provide differentiated texts. So differentiated texts are beneficial in that basically they teach the same content topic. So in this example I give in this picture, it's fidget spinners. So it still gives the essential information about fidget spinners, but it differentiates based on students' reading level. So students who are at a lower reading level will get more simple, straightforward sentences. They'll have less complicated vocabulary, maybe more images and pictures, more restating and rephrasing of key concepts so they make sure they understand it, so repetition, fewer words per sentence. But students who are reading above grade level might receive less scaffolds, more complicated academic vocabulary, longer passages, more complicated phrasing, or complex sentences. So there's actually some really good websites that once you find out your student's reading level, either through doing a diagnostic reading assessment, for example, through DRA or Fontes and Pinnell, or looking at their Lexile level, or getting their data from a program like iStation. Once you know students' reading level, there's websites like News ELA and readworks.org in which you can actually select differentiated text on a particular topic, like physical resources or like renewable resources or the water cycle. And you could find text at different reading levels so students could still get that same key essential content, but it's more comprehensible for them because it's at their reading level. So it allows them to also be more likely to complete the activity with less needing less support from their teacher and their peers. Another important scaffold is native language support. So even if you're an ESL teacher, and so you're an English as a second language teacher, that just because it says English in your title does not mean that you are not allowed to also expand on students' native language. So actually they've done research, and students who have a strong proficiency in their native language and they develop their native language are more likely to have a stronger proficiency in English, and also they learn English at a faster pace compared to students who really didn't learn too much of their native language and just went straight to all English programs. So native language support is very beneficial. There's many key skills that can transfer from students' native language to English. So reading comprehension skills. If they know how to summarize or to make inferences in their native language, then they'll be able to do that in English as well if you kind of show the connection. Or any kind of content knowledge they learned in science in their native language or any other topic can transfer to English as long as you show those connections and they learn the English vocabulary. There's also many cognates, so they're words that sound the same and mean the same and are spelled very similar that transfer from one language to another, especially Latin-based languages like Spanish, French, Italian, and Portuguese, and English. So like one example would be oxygen and oxígeno in Spanish. They're cognates. And so if you explicitly teach cognates to students and have students become aware of that and connect their prior knowledge and their prior academic vocabulary in their native language to what they're learning in English, that can be very beneficial. Some other ways you can develop students' native language and provide native language support is you could provide text in their native language, so books on the topic you're learning in their native language. You could provide them homework in their native language that they could review with their parents or with family members. You could provide them instructional videos or informational videos or multimedia in their native language. You could also provide peer or teacher support in their native language. So if a student is not understanding it in English, then it's fine to have their peer explain it to them in their native language. And if you speak their native language, you might even want to start out first explaining the concept in students' native language and then re-explaining it maybe in a different way in English. Hands-on learning experiences are a further valuable scaffold. So when students are physically manipulating what they're doing and they're physically acting out their learning or demonstrating their learning, they're more likely to remember what they're doing. Also, it's beneficial because students can copy your actions or your movements, and even if they don't understand every single word that you're saying in the lesson, if they're physically doing it with you or they're acting out or doing their or performing the task, they're more likely to have an overall comprehension of the concept. So some examples of hands-on learning experiences are experiments, like science experiments or demonstrations, readers' theater, where students are reading and acting out a play or acting out a story, kinesthetic learning, so maybe they're using base 10 blocks to model addition and subtraction, or maybe they're creating a visual model or a physical model of the content, or maybe they're creating a product or prototype. All of those things are hands-on learning experiences. There's also even hands-on learning experiences for vocabulary. So students maybe have to act out a vocabulary word, or they might have to play Pictionary, where they draw the vocabulary word and the students have to guess. Or they might have to play Taboo, where they act out and do charades with the vocabulary word without saying the word and without saying common words that are associated with that word. This is kind of similar to hands-on learning experiences, but manipulatives are another valuable scaffold. So manipulatives are basically objects that students can manipulate or move around to better understand a concept. Many times we see this in math, but they're actually in all subjects, really. But one type of manipulative could be actually like real objects or realia, which are like lifelike representations of an object. So that could be like a lifelike representation of a specific rock type, or a lifelike representation of a specific animal. Many times we use manipulatives in math with base 10 blocks, or fraction circles, or fraction pieces, or manipulative clocks that students can move around, or money, fake money, or shapes. All of those are forms of manipulatives, and it provides a hands-on learning activity. Sentence strips or sentence parts can be a way where students have to piece together a sentence physically, is a form of using a manipulative. We mentioned this a little bit, but realia are real-life objects, and they resemble real-life objects. The benefit of them is that they provide authentic materials and an authentic context that students can relate what they're learning to their daily lives. And also it seems more meaningful to them because they can see how it is similar to the real world. So maybe having menus, or for younger students, like realia of food items, or a real map would all be examples of realia. Anchor charts are a further important scaffold. Anchor charts are basically the teacher writing down key information or key steps in a process so that students can have it available when they're working on their own. So a good anchor chart is not too wordy. It has visuals, and it's clear and concise, and has the exact steps, the key elements you're trying to teach students, and it's available for students to see. So students are aware of the purpose of that anchor chart. That this is so you as a teacher might have to remind the students, by the way, if you get stuck during your practice opportunities with your partner or on your own, make sure you go back to our anchor chart we created together, and this can help remind you of what we're doing. Pre-teaching academic vocabulary is an important support system for students. You should pre-teach academic vocabulary before you actually get into the new lesson. This way, the new information, the new words that students are going to be exposed to is not overwhelming, and they won't interrupt you and say, hey, what does that word mean? Or they won't get lost during your lesson when you introduce a new academic vocabulary word. So it's a great way to pre-teach new academic vocabulary. Don't just tell students the meaning of a word. Have students practice with the word. So you might introduce to students that, hey, today we're going to talk about this new word, revolution. Now we're going to practice with it. So maybe students will draw a picture of a revolution. They'll think of examples that they've seen the word. Maybe they'll think of non-examples. They'll use the word in a sentence. They'll act out the word with a partner. They'll discuss the word with a partner. They'll think of their own student-friendly definition. All of these ways are ways to provide opportunities, several different exposures, provide students with the opportunity of having several different exposures to a new word, thoroughly practicing that word, developing a knowledge of that word so that when they see that in their lesson, they understand what the teacher is saying. Providing repeated modeling or demonstrations is beneficial. Many times your English language learners and students in general might not understand you the first time you explain something. So it's beneficial that you model things repeatedly. You give several practice examples or several practice demonstrations. You model out loud your thinking and why you are solving this problem a certain way, or why are you pursuing this activity in this way. You also need to provide several different examples and try to find examples from students' real lives or examples that students can relate to. Another thing is to provide comprehensible input. So modify the way you actually are saying and expressing the content. So some ways to provide comprehensible input is to slow down your pace in your speaking, to emphasize the key words, using maybe more simple and direct, straightforward sentencing, making sure you're enunciating clearly, using contextual definitions to restate some new vocabulary in a different way. So it's kind of like where you learn about the vocabulary word within the sentence itself. So here's an example. The teacher used scaffolds or learning supports to help her students understand the new content. So within that sentence itself, students from context can understand that new word. So even if they've already taught that word at the beginning of the lesson, they've pre-taught that vocabulary word scaffolds, it's nice to, within the lesson itself, also provide further comprehensible input and contextual support by having those contextual definitions as well. Read alouds are a great way to develop students' reading skills, their understanding of correct prosody, how to say things and state things and read fluently. Also, when you should, how to read with expression, how to pause during punctuation. It also models for students correct pronunciation. You can use it as an opportunity to build students' academic vocabulary. You could pre-teach the vocabulary words and go over the vocabulary words you see when in your read alouds. And it also helps develop students' reading comprehension because the teacher can have several pauses during the book to ask questions about what students have read or what students have heard the teacher read to them, the main ideas or the main events in a book, and also have students think about, use their critical thinking skills, make some conclusions or make inferences about the text or the characters. And then it's also nice to show students proper reading strategies as well. And so there's one reading strategy is to look at text features. So one way people do that with read alouds is they go through either a picture walk or a textual features walk, where they go through, the teacher goes through and has students make predictions based on the title, based on images or pictures, based on the captions, if there are captions under the images, based on the bolded print, what they're going to read. And then, based on students' predictions, they can kind of evaluate whether or not they were correct when they actually hear the book read aloud to them. So that's a nice strategy, and read alouds help model that through the picture walk. Here's a nice video that I would recommend looking, and we kind of already talked about this. Make sure you prep for stopping points. Make sure you do a picture walk so students have opportunities to make predictions about the text. When you do explain things, make sure you explain new words. Make sure you provide student-friendly definitions and have students practice with the words several times before you move on. Graphic organizers are another wonderful support for ELL students and all students. They model thinking visually. They also help students organize their thoughts, and it helps to also organize central concepts or components of the lesson. And the benefit of graphic organizers is because they add a visual support for students where they can use less language to still understand the key meaning or the key purpose of that specific thinking process. So if you look at that cause and effect chart, the student might have to write shorter sentences and they'll have a little bit less stress having to express their point of view, but they're still getting the concept of what is a cause and what is an effect and the relationship between the two. A word wall is a wonderful scaffold. This would be a place that you could list out the alphabet, and then you could even have students help you find words that you've talked about in class that have come up frequently or have come up as your academic vocabulary terms you've discussed, and post them under the word wall, under the letter it begins with. And the benefit of this, a nice thing too, is that like in this image, it's a great thing to provide visuals with students just so they remember what those words mean. But so if a student ever needs to reference how to spell a word, they can look at the word wall. Or if they forget maybe what the word means, they can associate it with the visual on the word wall. And also, it kind of develops a love of learning words with students, because if students are actively thinking about how they can add to their classroom word wall, they're going to want to learn new words, and they'll develop a passion for developing their vocabulary. All right, so these are all of the scaffolds I have for today. There are many more, so you're welcome to post some ideas or scaffolds that you have used in your classrooms or you have seen, and I'd be happy to discuss them in a subsequent video. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And remember, when you're teaching all students, make sure you differentiate for that specific learner. Meet them where they're at, provide them those scaffolds and those supports so that they're successful, and gradually increase the difficulty level until you fully challenge students to go to the furthest of their abilities. But please, whatever you do, do not teach all students the same way, especially not your English language learners. Try to provide scaffolds and supports, differentiate your instruction to meet the unique needs of your students so that all students are successful. Thank you.